"You don't belong in the army," said the officer. 6 months later, she saved his life in battle. What happens when a soldier the system tried to push out becomes the only one who can drag a wounded commander to safety under enemy fire? What happened next made everyone rethink who truly earns respect and the uniform. When Riley Walker first stepped onto that dusty training base in Georgia, she wasn't just walking. She was marching straight into the belly of every whispered doubt, every coded smirk, and every closed-door meeting where someone had once said, "We need more diversity in uniform." Her boots hit the asphalt like punctuation marks in a long overdue sentence, and the way she held herself, back straight, chin up, eyes fixed ahead, wasn't some textbook soldier stance. It was decades of inherited steel, wrapped up in a 20-something black woman with a jawline that said, "Try me." And of course, the Army wasn't about to roll out a red carpet, especially not for someone like her. She wasn't from a military family. She didn't carry a last name with medals hanging off it. And she sure wasn't the kind of recruit they pictured when they talked about fit for service. She didn't look like a Maxwell or a Whitmore or any of those names stitched across generations of, "Yes, sir." Her name was Walker, and that name had walked through a lot before it got here. The man waiting by the sign-in desk, Sergeant Kevin Marshall, looked like he'd been carved out of leftover drywall and bad decisions. Mid-40s, face like sandpaper, voice with just enough condescension to sting. When he flipped through her paperwork and landed on her name, his eyebrows did a slow, sarcastic dance. "Walker," he muttered like it was a challenge. "This some kind of joke?" Riley said nothing, because she knew that if you speak too soon, they hear arrogance, and if you stay silent, they hear defiance. But if you're black and female, honey, they hear whatever the hell they want. Marshall leaned closer, his breath somewhere between tobacco and stale ego. "You know where you are, girl? This ain't Instagram. This ain't your college debate team. This is the Army. Blood, sweat, and orders. Not sure you're cut out for this." From somewhere in the back, someone laughed. One of those nervous little hyena chuckles that always finds safety in someone else's insult. Another young recruit, all buzz-cut and country bravado, threw in his 2 cents. Maybe she thought this was a modeling gig in camo. Riley didn't flinch. She'd seen that look before. In school, when her track coach asked if her muscles ran in the family. At church, when the older ladies whispered because she didn't dress like a respectable girl. And from her own uncle, who once told her, "You better learn to keep your head down in a white man's world." She didn't come here for validation. She came because her mother worked double shifts at the clinic and still found time to stand tall. Because her father, may he rest, taught her that courage is what you do when no one's watching, or worse, when everyone's watching and hoping you'll fail. Day one, she was already the example. Not the leader, not even the underdog. The example. The black girl you overwork to prove a point. The one they assign to the hardest labor, then clock how long before she cracks. She carried ammunition crates solo, while others got to buddy up. She dug trenches in the noonday sun, while some got hydration breaks. She reassembled rifles so long her hands bled. And every time she did it right, it wasn't excellence. It was luck. It wasn't competence. It was surprising. Because folks like her weren't meant to thrive here. They were supposed to quit. By the third day, Sergeant Marshall orchestrated his first public takedown. Whole squad lined up in formation under the merciless sun. Someone messed up the tent setup the night before. Riley hadn't even been assigned that shift. Still, when it came time to pick a scapegoat, he didn't hesitate. "Private Walker," he barked. "Front and center." She stepped forward, eyes locked, arms at her sides. "Explain why your squad couldn't complete a simple task." "I wasn't in charge of that detail, Sergeant," she replied, voice calm like molasses. Marshall smirked. That smug, paternalistic smirk that black women across America know too well. "Of course you weren't. Why take responsibility, right? Just stand there and wait for someone to praise you for showing up." The chuckles came quick and quiet, the kind that live in the back of the throat when folks want to laugh, but not be caught laughing. Riley didn't blink. Her stare cut through the man like winter wind through cheap curtains. "I'm not asking for praise," she said, measured and low. "I'm just doing my job." Then she turned, boots crisp on the pavement, and walked back to formation, back to the heat, back to the silence. And that right there was the beginning of the real battle. They didn't attack her with fists or files. They used silence and sabotage. At the range, her rifle was mysteriously swapped for a malfunctioning one. During drills, she was assigned to watch the rear, alone, while the rest of the squad ignored her commands. She'd come back from training to find her uniform stuffed in a garbage can, a crumpled note shoved in the sleeve. "You don't belong here." The irony? She was the only one who knew how to stop a gas leak when it broke out in the tent. The only one who responded first when a soldier collapsed from heat stroke. the only one who could properly dress a torn ligament during an emergency simulation. But every victory fell into the sand. One night, while hand-washing her uniform in the communal restroom, because somehow the laundry schedule was full, Corporal Mendez walked in, a Puerto Rican with fighter's eyes and scars he never talked about. "They did this?" he asked, nodding at her soaked fatigues. "The washing machine decided I was expendable," Riley replied, wringing out her sleeves. Mendez perched on the sink like it was his front porch. "You know Marshall calls you a social project when no one's around, but I saw you out there when that truck flipped on the course. You pulled 3 guys out. You didn't blink." She looked up, tired but unbowed. "In this setup, you can be a hero all day long, but if you're black, you're still a temporary guest in somebody else's victory." He chuckled, dry and knowing. "Until they realize they can't function without you, then you're not a guest. You're necessary." Not that it made things easier. The following week brought a live simulation. Enemy attack. Evacuation protocol. Riley, thanks to a mistake in the assignment sheet, was named squad leader. She didn't buy the accident theory. Not for a second. This was a setup, a test. They expected her to fumble, to break down, to give them a reason to put her in a file marked "Told you so." She was given a broken map. The comms were glitchy, and somewhere in the terrain, Captain Peters had been injured and lost. One of the soldiers, smirking, tossed it her way. "Well, it's your show, Walker. Led the way. Or what, you need a moment to center yourself." She didn't flinch, just gave orders, assigned positions, and moved. No complaints, no second-guessing, just movement. Because when you're a black woman leading a squad of men who think you're ornamental, the only way forward is forward. She found Peters, dragged him out of a ravine, carried him, yes, carried, because there were no volunteers. When she reached the staging zone, sweat stinging her eyes, boots heavy with dirt, the men behind her were silent. Not out of respect, out of disbelief. Even Marshall couldn't muster a sarcastic quip. His arms were folded, expression unreadable, but his eyes, for the first time, they didn't scream, "You don't belong." They whispered, "Maybe you do." The Arizona desert didn't forgive fools in uniform, let alone those who arrived unprepared, and Riley Walker learned that truth the moment her boots hit the choking sand, which crawled into ears, the clogged fingernails, and burrowed into the pit of your soul where it stayed long after leaving the thermal blankets of the bivouac, only to be washed out of your bones months later, if at all. Here, in the barren, blistering expanse of Camp Bandera South, there was no shade for reprieve, no cooling promise of raindrops to relieve the weight of mind or body, just the relentless accusation of the sun and the invisible chains of rank and scrutiny locking her into a trial she didn't choose but couldn't refuse. And Riley had always known how to work without the safety of error margin, which in this place meant every breath, movement, and choice was a wager on endurance, resolve, and unvoiced anger. Sergeant Marshall, once loud with condemnation, had shifted tactics, dropping overt hostility in favor of something slower, more corrosive. The kind of contempt that seeps in like oil, thin and slick and staining everything it touches until it can't be scrubbed clean. He no longer barked orders at her. Instead, he traced her progress with eyes too quick to judge, as though he was watching a slow fall into whatever he assumed her limits were, closer than she'd let him know they truly lay. On the morning of mobility drills, he stepped in front of the formation before Alpha Squad assembled. "Today, Alpha Squad conducts a firefight evacuation," he announced, voice flat but slicing through the morning quiet like a dull machete. "Leader of the squad, Private Walker." Silence didn't just settle, it pressed, wrapped around everyone's throats like thick humidity. Corporal Rivers, still fond of mocking diversity in dress, let out a low snort. "Looks like feminism's got a warbird test, eh?" Riley stood tall in the formation, blistered fingers curling into fists, not out of fear, but fueled by that calculated, simmering fury you feel when injustice becomes your second skin. She didn't blink. She stood steady, looking ahead as if to say, "Bring it on." The clock didn't stop at 1600, but the desert heat did something else. Vibrated, pulsed, squeezed all hope of a mercy break. Motor hums from Humvees droned in the background. Tanks idled. Chipped asphalt seemed to melt beneath their boots. Riley was handed a map that looked ancient, coordinates bleeding into each other as if time itself were erasing clarity. Her radio buzzed in stutters. Static hissed like a snake before you hear its fangs. Command post waited in the distance, cameras off. Marshall, he lingered in the center of the staging area, posture unreadable, like he either hadn't noticed the map mix-up or he had noticed exactly what he wanted to. "Ready, Commander?" Marshall drawled. offering her the headset as if it were a prop soiled with sarcasm, accompanied by his lingering glance. "Don't get lost, okay?" Riley cocked her head, eyes locked on his. "I'm not here to get lost," she replied deliberately, her words bold enough to frame her purpose. "I'm here to bring my squad out, even if they don't think they need me." This wasn't a drill for her. This wasn't a glorified obstacle course. This was a crucible. They weren't in the luxury of simulators anymore. Somewhere out there among the marked enemy zones and buried sensor mines, Captain Peters, the observation officer, had taken a wound. They lost contact. They lost direction. Everyone waited for someone else to make the call. Rivers, flipping the map like it offended him, insulted casually. "No coordinates, no signal. And, pardon my language, you don't get a mulligan here. You got a miracle handy?" Riley didn't hesitate. "Then stay here," she said, measured but clear. "I am finding him." She stepped forward, leaving them behind. Through bristling brush, across cracked earth, past orange-tinted mannequin targets marked fire zone. Each footfall cracked louder than gunfire, because behind her, silence. So thick, it screamed judgment. 40 minutes later, she spotted him. Captain Peters lay slumped in a dry ravine, one leg bandaged, yellow smoke curling from his signal grenade, which had failed to ignite. His eyes lifted, half surprise, half new respect. "Seriously? It was just you?" he rasped. "We had a choice," Riley said, keeping her voice steady. "I chose to come." Peters nodded, like a man who thought he'd mastered steak his whole life and suddenly realized that beans and rice could feed a soul just as well. Retracing steps was harder. The air burned like holy text against your lungs. Peters' weight, the raw ache of his leg, the buzzing static of non-existent reception. They trudged back shoulder to shoulder, grit smeared across cheeks, sweat mingling with dry tears no one said aloud. She didn't pause. Because in this uniform, and especially in her skin, no one gives you the luxury of fatigue. It's you or nothing. When they broke the boundary back into staging, Marshall stood waiting, not with smugness, not with disdain, but with eyes caught between astonishment and something deeper. And that unsettled him more than yelling ever could. He stayed silent. Peters stepped forward first. "She saved my life," he declared, voice carrying, and something changed in the air. "I wanted official. Her name in the report." And that was all it took. Next day, Riley was called into the headquarters tent, Captain Miller's seal on the envelope. Inside, a transfer request to advanced training, signed by Peters and by Marshall. She pushed open the flap. Marshall sat at the window, arm wrapped in sling from a jump injury, face softer, less brittle than it had been under open sky. "You saved all of us," he said, tone low, absent of previous ego. "Even if none of us asked." Riley considered the weight of his words before speaking. "I wasn't looking for thanks." He shifted, looked at her without filters. "But yeah, if someone's going in first, you should be that person. I'd follow you. No games." They were simple words, but within them lay a history of his bias and of his defeat, witnessing strength he couldn't ignore. That evening, at roll call in the assembled tent, Captain Miller introduced her. Tactical Coordinator, Alpha Squad. All eyes on her. One look that stood out was Rivers. Not mocking now, but tight-lipped, assessing. He caught up to her afterwards, voice low. "I didn't think you had it in you. I'm used to seeing folks like you break, but damn, you're like armor." Riley didn't need light from his admission. She only nodded, because this wasn't about winning favor. It was about commanding presence. And now, for the first time, she was being heard. Afghanistan didn't joke. Not with your breath, not with your mind, and sure as hell not with your skin. The sand wasn't just part of the scenery. It was the enemy's silent soldier. It lodged itself in your gums like a taunt, crept under your armor like betrayal, scraped between your knees like it had something to prove. The desert didn't care how many push-ups you could do or how shiny your medals were. It only cared about truth, and it had a brutal way of uncovering it. Out there under that heavy sun, Riley Walker didn't feel like a symbol or a soldier or a social project. She felt like stripped steel. No polish, no ceremony. Just the sound of rotors slicing a black sky at 4:20 a.m. and the cold sweat you only get when you already know what kind of day it's going to be. The flight wasn't poetic. Nobody prayed out loud. No one's eyes looked for beauty. It was all business, hot, tired, and laced with the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone on board has silently acknowledged the same reality. Someone ain't coming back. Captain Miller had given the go like it was a grocery list. The chopper howled like it hated the plan. Riley sat on the edge of the platform, fingers tight around her rifle, boots half dangling like she'd already decided. "I go in first. That's just how it is." Next to her, ironically, beautifully, absurdly, sat Sergeant Marshall. Yeah, that Marshall. Same man who once declared to anyone who'd listen that Riley didn't belong in uniform. That women like her, black, sharp-edged, too focused, weren't built for the brotherhood of war. But today he was just another soldier strapped in beside her, gun at his side, mouth shut. There was no sarcasm, no cheap joke, just a glance and a single sentence. Hope you still remember how to save stubborn old men. Riley turned, slow and surgical. Her voice was dry from the dust, but her delivery was sharp. Only if the old man remembers who's in charge when bullets fly. Marshall didn't blink, just nodded, just once. And in that silence between them, something long-standing and heavy finally cracked. Not broken, but shifted. Because right then, in the belly of that bird, there were no ranks, just truth. And truth said she was the leader. The descent wasn't smooth. The landing felt like an argument with gravity, the kind that hurts, the kind that leaves bruises you don't see till later. Then chaos broke loose. No ceremony, no warning, just heat, wind, gunfire, and orders shouted over static that sounded like sandpaper. The air was thick with smoke and grit, and that bitter smell of too many promises not kept. Riley ran first, like always. But this wasn't ego. This wasn't for the cameras. She ran because where she came from, where you only make it out by making yourself essential, being first was the only option. You weren't allowed to hesitate. You didn't get to trip. And Lord knows if you failed, the whole failure would get stamped with your name and your skin color like a label in a history book. The mission was an extraction, routine on paper, messy in execution. She led the team through rubble, past broken walls, up twisted stairs that sounded like they'd scream at any moment. Then came the shout, like a crack across glass. "Man down! It's Marshall!" And just like that, time didn't slow. It stilled, locked, because that voice wasn't shouting bullets. It was shouting past. It was shouting him. The same man who doubted her, the same one who saw her as a problem wrapped in policy. And now, buried under what used to be a building, Sergeant Marshall was bleeding. She didn't pause, didn't blink. Training kicked in, but so did memory, pride, rage, and something that tasted like purpose. He was pinned under a concrete slab, leg crushed, dust thick around his lips. Gunfire cracked nearby like an argument she didn't have time to answer. "Leave me," he croaked. "It's over." Riley spat the dust from her teeth. "You don't get to decide when it's over." His mouth opened again, but she cut him off. "You think I carried all this just to leave you behind? After all that mouth?" And with that, she pulled, lifted, pushed, grit in her eyes, sweat pooling in the curve of her spine. The wall didn't budge easy, neither did she. Minutes passed like miles. The others covered, firing back, calling for support. She didn't hear them, just heard Marshall's breathing, ragged and panicked, and her own heartbeat steady like a drumline. "We don't leave anyone, not even him." She dragged him through the alley, ducked through the crumbled arch, fired twice into shadow, then moved, kept moving, because she knew this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about responsibility. It was about being the soldier you say you are. By the time they made it to evac, the chopper skids were already coated in grit and blood. She collapsed with him at her side, eyes wild but alive. Her shoulder burned. Blisters split under her armor, but she never flinched. The next morning, the field hospital hummed like a bitter lullaby. Marshall lay in bed, leg encased in plaster. Riley sat nearby, arm wrapped, shoulder bandaged. The silence was different this time. It wasn't heavy, it was whole. "I didn't think you'd make it," he said, voice hoarse. "You didn't think I'd make it past basic," she answered. He nodded slowly. "I was wrong. The system we're in, it doesn't like people like you. Too strong, too honest. You don't survive it, you change it." She looked at him then, really looked, and answered soft but clear. "I didn't come here to change you. I came to do my job, but I wasn't about to let you die thinking I was just a quota." He chuckled, pain flickering in his eyes. "You didn't just do your job. You made me believe again." A month passed. Recovery moved like molasses, but time didn't stop. At the awards ceremony, the hall was silent. Polished boots on linoleum, medals glinting under stale lights. Then the name rang out, Lieutenant Riley Walker, for leadership under fire, for saving lives under pressure, for doing what others would not. The applause started slow, then rose, then stood. Even Rivers clapped. Didn't say much. Didn't have to. The way he stood said enough. But the medal wasn't the real reward. The real reward came later, in a hallway too narrow and plain to hold any glory. Captain Miller walked beside her, file in hand. "I told you," he said, voice low. "You'd prove yourself in combat, But you didn't just prove yourself. You made this place see itself. Maybe for the first time, Riley smiled, tired but proud. Sometime, she said, a mirror is the only weapon left. And with that, she walked on. Because real victory isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks with you. Quiet, heavy, and earned.